Please. Well, welcome to any of you who are watching this online. I will do my best to incorporate you as I go through this. The opening session this morning is going to be mostly me talking. I'm always open to being interrupted with questions and other thoughts. I do not mind that at all. Indeed, I encourage it. This is, for a lot of you, this is going to be a recap and a reminder of things that you might have heard from me before, especially if you were in the Celtic series that we had about 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was. So this is Celtic Epiphany, and the theme of Epiphany is light. And I hope that what we do together will bring light to our souls and enlighten our minds. And the principal resource as we go through the class is this book by John Philip Newell, Sacred Earth and Sacred Soul. I imagine that you all have seen by now the outline of the class, which is, it's not really a class, it's a discussion, a conversation, but the outline is and has been in the bulletin for the last couple of weeks. And we're starting a week late because of weather last Sunday. I'm glad we are here this Sunday. And I don't know, do you know what's going to happen with response to Episcopal edicts about inline meetings?
No.
On face-to-face meetings? Thank you all. I will use this to keep you all apprised of any change in schedule because of mostly COVID, but maybe snow. So Barbara Townsend did not write her phone number or her email address. Or date.
Don't be there.
Where to begin? I've got notes. Actually, I've got a full manuscript of basically a lecture that I could post. I could put it online if anybody wants to read this. So let me go through, and I'll be reading a lot, but I hope with some opportunity for conversation. In the year AD 82, the Roman military governor of Britain, Julius Agricola, with his legions, reached the Isle of Mull, and already I need to make a map of some kind. I should have done this. Let me just,
Of course I do.
I think he's done this before.
Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Hadrian's Wall, Wales, Canterbury, Cornwall, Ireland, Isle of Man. Hebrides Islands up here, and the Isle of Mull is a little island right there, and out of Mull there's another little island which is crucially important, Iona. So the Roman legions started, all European invaders start down here, entering into the bottom right-hand corner, and they work their way north. And Agricola, Julius Agricola, in AD 82, got this far, and he looked over a narrow, it's only about 20 miles, from looking out from the Isle of Mull to the northern corner of Ireland, and he must have sent scouts ahead of time to see what was there, and he decided it wasn't worth the effort. that Ireland was so far away from the center of imperial power that as far as the empire was concerned, it was irrelevant. That decision was huge. And that's what we're going to be looking at for a little while. Southern Scotland, down here, it turned out was the outmost reach of the Roman Empire. And if you think about it, this part of Scotland, all of Wales, and all of Ireland, while it's distant, they're also kind of mountainous. They're not very accessible, not good for building classical Roman roads for movement of military people. So it was a decision that was in favor of military and commercial interests. There was nothing there worth going for. So in the so we need to go back to understand how the people who ended up being pushed into these areas, the Celts, we need to go back several centuries to figure out how they ended up being here and why we think of these places as being notably Celtic. In the 8th century before Christ, BCE, when Amos and Hosea were prophets in the tribal culture of ancient Israel, a different tribal culture was spreading throughout Europe, from Turkey in the east to Spain in the west. If you can see it, the pink area of this map of Europe was all Celtic. This was the range, the extent of the Celtic. They weren't really imperial, but it was a culture that spread from Turkey all the way to Spain and north into Germany and obviously Britain and Ireland. And traces of their Iron Age civilization are left throughout Europe. The spread of Celtic influence was rapid. This started around 700 BC, and by 400 BC, this was the extent of it. It was remarkable. By 500 BC, there are hundreds of hill forts and burial sites in Britain, so it had extended all the way there. Although the Celts left no written record, their culture, archaeologists discern the extent and pattern of their culture in funerary customs, how they buried the dead, and other artifacts, as well as from the written records of other cultures. In 400 BC, Celtic hordes crossed the Alps and invaded Italy. In 390, led by their chief Brennus, the Celtic warriors sacked Rome. It was the height of Celtic power, and it was over against these Celtic invaders that Rome developed its own identity and might. In 230 BC, the Galatians, who were Turkish Celts and were defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Pergamon in Italy. 5 years later, the Romans slaughtered, get this, 25,000 Celts in a single battle, at the Battle of Telamon in Italy. It gives you a sense of the hordes who were not city builders. They didn't leave great monuments and established communities. They were roaming hordes. And after that battle, Celtic culture was pretty much on a downhill slide. The Roman Empire expanded throughout Europe, pushing the migrating Celtic tribes further and further north. The Celts did not build cities, nor did they codify laws. We know little of their theology and nothing of their most ancient poetry. They were superb metal workers and stone carvers. In modern France, there is a burial site dating to 550 BC, to provide the dead with the necessities of the afterlife. The grave has an ornate bronze cauldron with the residue of 200 gallons of honey mead. There are drinking horns lining the grave. Clearly, these Celts believed in heavenly banquets long before they heard Christian missionaries talk about them. As they survived into the early Christian era, the Celts were rural farmers, artisans, bards, maritime traders, and warriors. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar invaded Britain, starting down here, extending the power and organizational genius of the empire, and further isolating the Celts. Within 100 years, Roman influence dominated what is now England. In AD 87, Julius Agricola was appointed military governor in Britain, and he immediately pushed the Roman garrisons into the outer reaches of the British Isles. And he defeated the Caledonian army in southern Scotland, and that's where we started. In AD 82, Agricola decided not to invade Ireland, and no subsequent governor ever reversed that decision. In a great defensive move to protect themselves from the Picts, who were Scots, Pictish invaders were often making raids into Roman establishments in Northumbria, in northern England. And so to protect themselves from these vicious Scots, the empire built Hadrian's Wall right across here. This is not very much to scale. The Hadrian's Wall was built in 122 AD, and it's only 73 miles long. But the great irony of it is, not only did it protect the empire from being invaded by these tribal warriors, the Picts, it also protected all of Scottish culture from influence by the Roman Empire, which turns out to be, for the purposes of our course, very significant. So in 387 AD, the Roman Empire, as a military and unifying force of the then known world, it's kind of arrogant of Western perspective that we call Europe the known world, but the Roman Empire was clearly in retreat, and by 410, Rome itself was sacked and was in decline. I've called this series, this conversation, Celtic, and that is right. And the best known Celtic cultures are Ireland and Scotland, but also Wales. And there's a corner of England in Cornwall. There's also the Isle of Man in the middle of the Irish Sea. There's also a curious section in the northwest corner of England, Brittany, which has Celtic influence, and also on the west coast of Spain, Galicia. These are little pockets that still have evidence of Celtic culture there, in their language and in some of the archaeological finds, burials and the like, that say that's where the Celts had high influence. But I must say, Ireland particularly was never a part of the Roman Empire. Unlike Britain, Britain was completely subjugated by Roman influence. There were Roman cities and Roman armies encamped throughout what we now call England. So, how is that significant? Mostly, I speak about Ireland because of its isolation from the rest of European development, that is to say, Imperial Roman development. Yet much of what I say about Ireland's independent spirit and veneration of nature is true of other cultures as well. Celts have been pushed to the most distant corners of the empire, where their distinctive languages and cultures flourished, eventually outlasting the empire itself. They believed in the unity of all creation. Women were honored as leaders, and like the earliest generations in the book of Genesis, they told their truth with stories and poetry, sometimes with details that seem perfectly ridiculous, fantastical to our ears. So, in the meantime, Christianity had spread from the Eastern Mediterranean through Europe with evangelical fervor. By the middle of the 2nd century of the church, the church was well established in what is now England. Some missionary efforts had been made coming from England into Ireland, but they failed, and nothing really took hold until just 2 years after the Roman legions left England, in AD 389, a child was born to Celtic Christian parents in northwest England, and the boy's name was Padraig. Grew up in a privileged home, his father having been a church deacon, and his grandfather a priest. We know him by his Latin name, better, Patrick. And when he was 16 years old, Patrick was probably born in this area of northwest England, perhaps in the corner of Wales. It's not quite sure whether he was Welsh or English. I like to say he was English, but I could be wrong there. But he was captured by Irish invaders and taken to Ireland. Probably Dublin is down here, and he was probably somewhere in this area of Ireland. For next week, maybe I'll try and do a better map. And for 6 years, he was a captive, and during that 6 years, he was a sheep herder, and he must have identified with the community and understood it well, but he still yearned to escape. He wrote a biography. There are 2 documents that we have from Patrick that he actually wrote. One was an autobiography in which he wrote about his captivity in Ireland and his return, and another was his Confessions, which is just his proclamation of faith. He was not particularly literate. His language is fairly primitive Latin, but fortunately he did write in Latin, which is pretty accessible to us and to scholars. And Patrick finally escaped. He would have been early 20s. He escaped from captivity in Ireland, returned to his home in England, where he studied to become a priest, which he did. And he worked in England as a priest probably for 5 or 6 years. And in a dream vision, he heard the people of Ireland beckoning him back to proclaim the gospel to them. And so he did. He got ordained and consecrated as a bishop. And back in those days, bishops were not simply administrators of jurisdictions, especially in England that was true. They were missionaries and teachers. That was the primary role of a bishop. And we'll see how that played out in Irish culture. returned to Ireland in 432. And here I want to shift gears. You have perhaps heard me tell some of these stories before, but Patrick was such a giant in Irish history that he must be honored as both historic figure and mythic hero. So first let me tell you the true story, and then I'll tell you some mere facts. Patrick landed with 12 monks, and from his earlier captivity he was aware of the pagan practices of the Irish kings, especially of the High King of Tara, who would have been pretty close to the area where he was first captured, most likely. And each spring at the equinox, the king would erect a great pyre on the top of the mountain. And it was his exclusive privilege to light the fire to welcome the new life of the season. Patrick led his 12 monks, and we should recognize that that's a highly symbolic number for a religious leader and followers. He led them towards the hill that was only a few miles from Tara. And if ever the monks were in danger of being found, they would mysteriously change their shape and become deer, thereby invisible as a threat. Patrick and his monks went up their hill. Does anybody yet know the name of the hill? Yes, you do. Slain. Slain. And there is a magnificent hymn that we actually are singing this morning in church. The tune is named Slain. It's one of my favorite hymns. But so Patrick lit his own pyre on top of the hill Slain, and the king, Leary, was furious, and he wanted to know who dared to take that privilege upon himself and not wait for the king to light. So Leary is spelt, by the way, Laioghare. Of course. How else would you spell Leary? If you look at any kind of Irish, Welsh are even crazier than the Irish spellings. It's totally nuts. And you do not know how to pronounce them unless a native tells you. So Patrick, meanwhile, he was on his way to Tara to meet with the king. And he came to the king and explained what he was doing and who he was, and proclaimed the gospel to King Leary, who did not himself accept the gospel, but he did allow Patrick to go throughout the land preaching. And given the nature of tribal culture, that was what Ireland was, Patrick would befriend and proclaim the gospel to the tribal chieftain, who would then proclaim the gospel to his family. And in a matter of 50 years, Ireland was completely Christianized. It was converted to the gospel, and there is evidence of not one single martyrdom in the process. It was an entirely friendly and benign process. And I think that part of the reason for that was Patrick's style of evangelism. And I'm doing some reconstruction and imagination here, but because of his 6 years of captivity in Ireland, he became obviously familiar with Irish customs, and from the way he behaved, he was not just familiar but also respectful. And this cross, which is distinctively Celtic, and even more specifically Irish, This is a copy of a 9th century cross in Ireland, the Murdoch cross at Monasterboice. But this cross is highly symbolic. It's got the classical Roman vertical and horizontal bars, which is the cross of crucifixion and also the cross of resurrection. Indeed, this side represents, this is the the north side of the cross, and all of the pictures, the carvings on it represent the crucifixion. The opposite side, the obverse, is covered with illustrations of resurrection. So all of that is what this cross represents. Then you have the circle in the middle, which is symbolic of the universe and of the sun. And the pre-Christian Druidic faith was centered on the sun. That was the focus of its worship. And a later view of Christian missionaries, if you think about how Christians went through the South Pacific with the intention of obliterating former pagan religious practice and making them all Christian. We've seen the same treatment in both Canada and the United States of native culture and native religion, I'm even willing to concede good intention. The intention, though, was to obliterate former forms of faith and expressions and replace it with Christianity. What Patrick did was not to obliterate, but baptize. And he baptized that pagan faith of the Druids. The word pagan, it's usually thought of these days as meaning at least ignorant and probably evil. All it means is rural. It means of the country. And that suggests a closeness to nature and natural cycles. I'm not sure where I've got this in my notes, but now's a good time to talk about the fact that if you think about it, the Old Testament was written by a tribal culture in places that had very few cities. Jerusalem was developed as a central place, the city of David, but it was only a few hundred people, maybe a couple of thousand at some points. It was a small, very rural community. And the culture was tribal. We know of the 12 tribes. It's why Jesus had 12 disciples. It's a kind of representative of all the people. And so their religious sensibility was shaped by Moses going up the mountain, Moses engaging with nature in crazy things like separating the Red Sea, and all of the religious revelations came in the context of natural phenomena. A storm, and after the storm, a still small voice. And that carries over into the Gospels. The bulk of Jesus' teaching happened in the natural amphitheaters around the Sea of Galilee. It was a very aware of nature kind of preaching that Jesus carried out. Now think of the rest of the New Testament. Name some of the New Testament books, mostly Pauline letters. Ephesians,
Romans,
Romans,
Galatians,
Galatians, Corinthians,
Timothy,
Thessalonians. They're all cities. The growth, the earliest generation of the growth of Christian faith, especially into Gentile culture, was urban. It was dramatically different from the culture in which Judaism and the first generation of Jesus followers lived. Where else in the Roman Empire could there have been such a culture? Non-urban rural cultures. Ireland and Scotland, and to some extent Wales too, were distinctively friendly to the entire culture of the Old Testament and the Gospels. When they spoke of the King of Heaven, kingship for them was not an empire, not a potentate with all power, but was the leader of a small city community, a small town, a rural community. And kings were not so much like the omnipotent creator of Genesis 1, but were more like the kind of gentle, avuncular presence of God in Genesis 3, who is walking through the garden in the cool of the day. Very accessible. So their understanding of God in God's self was that God is approachable. God is not so awesome as he is a companion. That is a theme that runs through the entire development of Christianity in Ireland, particularly after Patrick's evangelism, and Ireland was pretty much locked into being Christian. It is wrong to call it Catholic at this point. It is simply Christian. Right through until the 11th century. Some of the distinctive differences that developed in Ireland, and all of this is also true of other Celtic cultures, but it's distinctively, dominantly true of Ireland. First off, the Imperial Church, that is the church in mainland Europe, developed organizational structures that were very much dependent on the organizational structures of the empire itself. A diocese was a unit of Roman Empire political organization. It was kind of like a city ward. It was a subset of the empire, a diocese was. It was pretty easy for the church to take that unit of sort of geographical dominance on and put the bishop in charge of it. The word bishop does mean overseer. Episkopos means overseer. And so, whereas in Celtic culture, they adapted the tribal culture and around structures of monasteries. They didn't have so much regional dioceses as monastic communities. And bishops were, their primary function was to teach and ordain and that was it, to preach and teach. Organization was the responsibility of abbots. They were the hierarchical top of the the organizational pyramid. Also, abbesses, because that's another significant difference. Women in Celtic culture had significant responsibility and authority. They had clout. There are, we'll be talking about Bridget of Kildare in a couple of weeks, and she was hugely influential. After Patrick, probably the second most beloved saint in Irish history. They had large, in the Imperial Church in mainland Europe, they had large churches and basilicas. And in Ireland, they had small churches, communities, and churches that seemed to be outdoors. All of these crosses were built outdoors, and exactly why is not always clear, but the dominant understanding is that they were gathering places and places for teaching. That's what all of the illustration is about. It's to teach the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And there are other characters, which I won't go into, but these are teaching devices for a gathered community. So even the worship was outdoors as much as possible, very kind of nature friendly and close. There seems to have been developing materialism in the Imperial Church with fine vestments and the like. There is magnificent material evidence, though, from Celtic tradition early in the 8th century, 7th century even. The Celts, the Irish, were brilliant metalworkers. At some other point, I'll try and bring in pictures of some of the fine gold and silver tracery that the Celtic culture developed. Increasingly in the West, in the Imperial Church, clergy got all the power, and laity were not allowed into holy areas of church. And so that was the difference, again, in imperial religion, different from what was being practiced in Ireland. As I mentioned, the women who were leaders in Irish church, women were increasingly isolated, and the cult of Mary developed in the West, in what became the Roman Church. Mary is revered, but not that much differently from other saints in Irish tradition. She is one of the main saints, true, but not in the same sense. In Roman Catholicism these days, there is two ways of understanding our relationship to the saints. Most saints get dulia, which is a certain form of honoring them and inviting their prayers. Mary is unique in that she gets hyperdulia. That distinction is not made in the kind of relationship that the Celtic Church has to the saints. They are seen as companions for the journey. And we've got about 5 minutes to go. Are there questions or comments so far?
Well, one thing I'm aware of, maybe you can let me know whether I'm right about this or not, but ever since the formal Imperial Church organized, I think around 313 AD, the focus, or maybe even the obsession, became individual salvation. And in the Celtic cultures, that was not there. It was group, kindness and caring and loving, sharing meals, inculcating the beauty of nature. But this obsession with individual salvation has been, well, some people feel, in many ways, the ruin of the project of the Western Church. Would you comment on that? I mean, this is something I've read.
Yeah, that distinction will become clearer when we look at Pelagius and Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, some of you know my issues with Augustine. I think that what he has done to Western culture around, especially around issues of sexuality, is absolutely horrible. At the same time, he is one of the greatest minds that has ever claimed Christian identity. And he's a genius as a writer and as a thinker, and I have nothing but awe for his theological output, except that a lot of it was horribly wrong. But his doctrine, his book on the Trinity is absolutely thrilling. If you can get thrilled by theology, Augustine can do it. But I think that he was devastatingly wrong on so many critical issues of cultural development, and one of those was kind of an individualism around salvation, and it's because of his preoccupation with sin and his development of the doctrine of original sin, and we'll get a little bit more into that in the next couple of weeks. Tell you what, it is now 11:15. Well, it's not. It's 17 minutes to 10. I mean, 17 minutes to 10. One more question? Anything or an observation? Would you like me? And I didn't get through all my notes, obviously, but I can send this out to you as an attachment to an email if you'd like me to do that.
Yes, please.
Yes.
All right, I will do that. I suggest for next week, if you can read.
Right over there.
Good man, Mark. Thank
Well,
you.
no, it's not that. It's pure self. Do you have a scrap of paper? I need to write down the title of the book.
Oh, sure. I'd like to steal pens.
Here's some paper.
Oh,
Did I see the book?
Here, here's the book.
oh, I need to. Oh, you got it right.
This will be better.
For next week, do please read Pelagius. Read, if you can, read through Pelagius, even through St. Bridget. We're missing a week, and I'd like to try and catch up. I don't want to have to go into Lent if I don't have to, and we're booked. In this space, I hope that this space can work for us better than the parish hall. I mean the church office lounge. It's crowded. I like having a table in front of me and throwing books around and the like. So, God bless you all. Thank you very much for being here. There's 4, 8, 12 of us. That's not too bad.
Hey, that's very biblical.
Yeah.
Sign the paper.